What if everything you were taught about the discovery of America is a carefully crafted myth? For centuries, textbooks told us that Christopher Columbus set foot on these shores in 1492 and discovered a new world. But here's the contradiction. Evidence scattered across continents suggests others arrived long before him. From Norse sagas to forbidden artifacts, from ancient maps to unexplainable genetic links, the real story of who first touched American soil may have been buried on purpose. Tonight, we unravel the mystery. Before we go deeper, don't forget to subscribe, press the bell icon, and comment below where you're watching from. It really helps us keep going. For generations, history classes across the world have opened with the same iconic image. Christopher Columbus, sailing bravely across the Atlantic with 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, finally spotting land after weeks of uncertainty. This scene has been painted as the ultimate turning point in Western civilization. The beginning of the so-called Age of Discovery. Columbus was framed as a visionary, a hero who dared to challenge the flat earth thinkers of his time, and who single-handedly connected the old world to the new. It's a powerful story, repeated so often that it feels untouchable. But the cracks begin to show the moment you look closer first. Columbus did not discover a new world. When he arrived in the Bahamas in October of 1492, the Americas were already home to tens of millions of people, advanced societies with complex political systems, trade networks, and cultural traditions stretching back thousands of years. Calling his voyage a discovery erases the existence of civilizations like the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca, not to mention countless indigenous nations across North America. So why was this framing Columbus as the discoverer repeated, institutionalized, and cemented into school books for centuries? The answer lies in how history is written, and more importantly, who gets to write it. By the late 15th century, Spain and Portugal were locked in a fierce competition for overseas dominance. Columbus's voyage wasn't just an adventure, it was a propaganda tool. Spain needed a symbolic figure, a hero who could represent the beginning of their global empire. Columbus, though controversial even in his own time, fit the role perfectly. His story was polished, repackaged, and promoted not for accuracy but for political utility. Even the myth that Columbus proved the earth was round is misleading. By 1492, educated Europeans already knew the earth was spherical. That debate had been settled since the time of the ancient Greeks. The real question was size. How far Asia was from Europe by sea? Columbus underestimated the earth's circumference dramatically. By his calculations, the journey westward to Asia was a fraction of its true distance. Ironically, if the Americas had not been in his path, his fleet would have perished long before reaching Asia. Yet in school books, his error is erased, replaced with the narrative of a daring genius who reshaped human knowledge. This carefully curated legend spread through Europe, and centuries later, across the Atlantic itself. When the United States was seeking to define its own national identity in the 18th and 19th centuries, Columbus was resurrected as a founding hero. Poems, plays, and public celebrations turned him into a near mythical figure. By 1792, the 300th anniversary of his voyage, Columbus had become a symbol of exploration and progress. Towns were named after him, statues erected in his honor, and eventually, an entire holiday, Columbus Day, enshrined his legacy. But here's where the story gets even more troubling. Every time alternative evidence emerged, suggesting that others may have reached the Americas before Columbus, those findings were downplayed or outright dismissed. The reason wasn't purely academic, it was political. If Columbus wasn't the first, then Spain's historical claim to the Americas, and later the United States' symbolic heritage tied to that claim, would be undermined. History was less about truth and more about ownership. Textbooks reinforced this version of events with remarkable consistency. Generations of students learned that in 1492, Columbus discovered America. The sentence is short, simple, and easy to memorize, but it's also misleading at every level. He didn't discover an uninhabited land. He wasn't the first European to set foot there. And his voyage was less about scientific curiosity and more about empire, profit, and power. The consequences of this myth are still felt today. By elevating Columbus as the heroic discoverer, the narratives of indigenous peoples were silenced. Entire civilizations were recast as background characters in a European drama. Worse still, this framing justified colonization and conquest. If Columbus discovered a new world, then the people already living there were treated as if they didn't matter, as if their presence was accidental, temporary, or irrelevant to the real story of history. It's no surprise then that modern historians, archaeologists, and even indigenous scholars have called for a fundamental re-examination of this myth. They argue that discovery isn't about planting a flag. It's about contact, encounter, and recognition. And by that definition, Columbus was only one chapter in a much longer story, a story that began centuries, perhaps even millennia before 1492. The irony is that even Columbus himself never believed he had discovered a new continent. Until his death in 1506, he was convinced he had reached islands near Asia. The idea of a new world was applied later by map-makers and scholars. The hero narrative, the neat timeline, the tidy beginning, these were inventions, crafted to make history cleaner and more flattering to those in power. So, when we say Columbus discovered America, what we're really repeating is a political slogan disguised as history. And like all slogans, it's meant to be simple, memorable, and unquestioned. But history isn't simple. The truth is messy, complicated, and often inconvenient. And when you start digging into the evidence, a startling realization emerges. Columbus may have been late to a party that had already been going on for centuries, which raises a critical question. If Columbus wasn't first, then who was? And why were their stories buried beneath the sands of time, while his was elevated to mythic status? When we think about fearless seafarers who carved their way into history, one group stands apart, the Vikings, long before Columbus ever sailed west. Norse explorers had already ventured across the icy North Atlantic. Their sagas, part myth, part history, speak of journeys to distant lands they called Vineland, a place rich with timber, wild grapes, and fertile soil. For centuries, these tales were dismissed as folklore. But what happens when legends begin to line up with hard evidence? Suddenly, the neat story of Columbus as the first begins to crumble. The man at the center of this Norse chapter is Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who had already colonized Greenland after being exiled from Iceland. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif set sail westward. Following rumors of land beyond the horizon, according to the Icelandic sagas, he reached a place unlike Greenland's icy wastelands, mild climate, abundant resources, and terrain that seemed almost like paradise compared to the harsh north. They named it Vinland, and it became one of the most compelling mysteries in medieval literature. For centuries, skeptics argued these sagas were exaggerated stories told by poets. But in 1960, everything changed. Archaeologists Helgi and Anne Ingstad uncovered a site at L'Anse aux Meadows, at the northern tip of Newfoundland in Canada. What they found shocked the academic world. The remains of Norse-style houses, iron nails, rivets, and evidence of boat repair workshops. Carbon dating placed the site at around 1000 AD, nearly 500 years before Columbus set foot in the Bahamas. This discovery forced historians to admit that the sagas weren't just tall tales. The Vikings had, in fact, crossed the Atlantic and built a settlement in North America centuries earlier. For the first time, the Columbus first narrative had undeniable competition. The evidence was literally dug out of the ground. Norse turf houses, the unmistakable remains of ironworking, something indigenous North Americans in that region did not practice, and tools that matched Viking craftsmanship. But the real intrigue lies not just in the fact that the Vikings made it here, but in how their story was buried for so long. Why were Norse voyages downplayed? Even after solid archaeological proof was found, one reason is that their presence didn't last. Unlike the Spanish conquest, which reshaped entire continents, the Norse footprint in North America was temporary. Harsh winters, limited supplies, and conflicts with local indigenous groups whom the sagas call Skraelings meant that these settlements were abandoned after only a few years. Yet, even a short-lived presence is enough to change history. It means Europeans touched North America centuries before Columbus. It means the discovery wasn't a sudden moment in 1492, but part of a longer chain of exploration. And it means that history as we know it was selectively told, choosing Columbus as the hero because his voyage aligned with imperial ambitions. While the Norse story faded into the margins, the sagas themselves offer fascinating detail. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red describe voyages not only to Vinland, but also to other lands they called Markland and Helluland, believed to correspond to parts of Labrador and Baffin Island. These names weren't random. They matched the resources of each region. Helluland, the land of flat stones, described the rocky Canadian Arctic. Markland, the land of forests, described Labrador. Vinland, with its grapes and greenery, fit southern Newfoundland or possibly even further south. The consistency between these descriptions and actual geography makes it hard to dismiss the accounts as pure invention. And then there's the question of influence. Did these Viking journeys leave behind more than ruins? Some researchers argue that traces of Norse contact may still exist in indigenous oral traditions, which speak of pale-skinned visitors arriving by sea long before Europeans arrived in force. While controversial, these stories add another layer to the mystery. Was there more interaction between Norse settlers and native peoples than we've been told? What makes the Viking story so powerful is how it disrupts the Columbus myth. If children grew up learning that Leif Erikson, not Columbus, was the first European to reach America, the cultural symbolism of discovery would look very different. In fact, some U.S. states, particularly those with strong Scandinavian heritage like Minnesota, celebrate Leif Erikson Day on October 9th. Yet on a national level, the Columbus narrative still dominates. That's not an accident. It's the result of centuries of political storytelling. Consider this. Even after L'Anse aux Meadows was discovered, school books barely changed. Columbus remained the centerpiece, while Viking explorations were treated as a quirky side note. Why? Because Columbus's voyage led directly to colonization, conquest, and the birth of modern empires. The Norse, by contrast, came, stayed briefly, and left. Their story lacked the imperial payoff, and so it lacked the political value that Columbus's legend delivered. Still, the archaeological record continues to expand. In recent years, new studies have suggested that the Vikings may have traveled further south than Newfoundland. Wooden artifacts, pollen samples, and even DNA hints suggest they might have explored parts of New England or beyond. A 2021 study used tree ring analysis to show that Norse settlers were active in Newfoundland by the year 1021, an exact date that pushes their presence firmly into history rather than speculation. This precision matters. It anchors the sagas in hard science. It proves that Europeans reached North America centuries before Columbus. And it raises the uncomfortable question: if this has been proven for decades, why is Columbus still taught as the discoverer? The answer points not to the evidence itself, but to how history is curated. Columbus's story was useful, the Viking story wasn't. The Norse legacy in North America may have been brief, but its impact on our understanding of history is profound. It forces us to rethink what discovery really means. Is it planting a flag, establishing a permanent colony, or simply being the first to cross an ocean? If it's about being first, then Columbus doesn't even come close. If it's about impact, then perhaps the Vikings lose to the Spanish. But if it's about truth, the record is clear. The story we've been told is incomplete, and here's where the mystery deepens. Some researchers believe that Viking voyages were not isolated events, but part of a broader pattern of contact. Could Norse explorers have traded knowledge, stories, or even genes with indigenous peoples? Could traces of these encounters still lie hidden in archaeology or oral tradition? If so, then the Norse weren't just visitors. They were part of a larger, forgotten network of pre-Columbian exploration. What's certain is that the Viking footprint shatters the idea of Columbus as the solitary hero who opened the New World. Instead, it reveals a richer, messier truth. America was known, reached, and touched long before 1492. The evidence is in the soil of Newfoundland, in the pages of the sagas, and in the contradictions of the stories we've been told. So the question becomes, if the Vikings came first, who else might have? And what evidence of their journey still lies hidden, waiting to be uncovered? When we talk about who reached the Americas before Columbus, most people know about the Vikings. But what if the story goes even further? What if explorers from Africa and Asia crossed the Atlantic centuries earlier, riding the same winds and currents that would later carry European ships? The idea sounds radical after all. History textbooks rarely mention it. But when you start looking at oceanography, oral traditions, and unexplained artifacts, the possibility becomes impossible to ignore. Let's start with Africa. The Atlantic Ocean may look intimidating, but its currents are predictable highways. The Canary Current flows south along the coast of Africa, while the North Equatorial Current sweeps westward across the ocean, carrying anything caught in its grip directly to the Caribbean and the Americas, even without modern navigation. Ancient sailors could have ridden these currents across in weeks. The question is, did they? One story stands out. In the 14th century, the powerful West African Empire of Mali dominated trade across the Sahara and beyond. Gold, salt, and knowledge flowed through its cities, and its rulers were wealthier than most European kings, according to Arab historians. Mali's ruler before Mansa Musa, a man known as Abu Bakr II, wasn't content with ruling just Africa. He was obsessed with the ocean. Chroniclers like Al-Umari recorded that Abu Bakr launched not one but two massive expeditions into the Atlantic. The first, he said, sent out 200 ships filled with men and supplies. Only one returned, reporting that the rest had vanished into the horizon. Instead of abandoning the dream, Abu Bakr doubled down. He abdicated his throne to Mansa Musa, built an even larger fleet, some accounts say 2,000 ships, and personally led them westward, never to return. If these chronicles are true, then Mali may have attempted a transatlantic voyage nearly 200 years before Columbus. Mainstream historians often dismiss the story as legend, arguing that wooden ships couldn't have survived the crossing, but the currents suggest otherwise. African sailors were already skilled navigators of rivers and coastlines, and if even a fraction of Abu Bakr's fleet reached the Americas, it could explain some intriguing traces. Consider this. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he recorded that some indigenous people already possessed small gold spear tips, unlike anything he had seen before. The metal composition, some researchers argue, closely matched West African sources. Others point to similarities in agricultural practices and even words shared between Mandinka languages of West Africa and native tongues of the Americas. While controversial, these connections suggest more than coincidence. They hint at contact, but Africa isn't the only contender. Half a world away across the Pacific, another great civilization may have reached the Americas long before Columbus. The Chinese. During the early 15th century, under the Ming dynasty, Admiral Zheng He commanded the largest fleet the world had ever seen, giant treasure ships capable of carrying hundreds of sailors, vast stores of supplies, and advanced navigation tools. Zheng He's voyages across the Indian Ocean and as far as East Africa are well documented. But some researchers, like Gavin Menzies in his book 1421, The Year China Discovered America, argue that these fleets may have gone even further, crossing the Pacific and reaching the Americas decades before Columbus. Mainstream historians are skeptical of Menzies' claims, pointing out gaps in hard evidence, but scattered clues remain tantalizing. Some indigenous legends on the Pacific coast describe visitors arriving in massive ships. Strange artifacts, such as Asian-style pottery fragments and early map outlines, raise questions that haven't been fully answered. Even Columbus himself, on his later voyages, noted rumors of large ships seen by indigenous people sailing west from the direction of Asia. And let's not forget the Polynesians, master navigators of the Pacific. Long before Europeans dared sail out of sight of land, Polynesian sailors were crossing thousands of miles of open ocean using only the stars, the winds, and the patterns of waves. They colonized islands scattered across the Pacific. From Hawaii to Easter Island, could they have reached the coast of the Americas? Recent DNA evidence suggests they did. Studies show traces of Polynesian ancestry in some indigenous populations of South America. And even more intriguingly, traces of South American sweet potatoes in Polynesia dating back nearly 1,000 years. This means there was contact voyages across the Pacific that carried crops, genes, and stories long before Columbus was even born. Now let's return to Africa for a moment. Some researchers argue that even without grand fleets like Mali's, smaller-scale contact may have happened. Ancient Egyptians, Carthaginians, and later West Africans all built ships capable of open-sea travel. The Atlantic currents are so strong that even accidental drift voyages could have carried small boats to American shores. If we know that storms and currents carried shipwrecked Europeans across the ocean in later centuries, why rule out the same for Africans centuries earlier? The silence in mainstream history books isn't because the evidence doesn't exist. It's because the evidence doesn't fit the established narrative. Think about it. If school children learned that Africans or Asians reached the Americas first, the story of European discovery would lose its central role. Columbus would no longer be the hero who connected worlds, but just another latecomer in a long chain of exploration. And yet, the traces keep surfacing. Carvings in Central and South America that resemble African faces. Linguistic overlaps that seem too precise to dismiss. Botanical exchanges that suggest travel and trade. None of these alone prove the case, but together they paint a picture that is too complex to ignore. The real question is, why do these stories keep getting buried? Why are African voyages treated as folklore, while Columbus's voyage is enshrined as fact? Why are Chinese or Polynesian connections waved away as coincidence, when the evidence points toward contact? Perhaps because acknowledging these truths would mean rewriting history on a global scale. What becomes clear is this: the oceans were not barriers. They were bridges. They carried people, ideas, and cultures across vast distances long before European empires began their conquest. The story of America's discovery is not a single moment in 1492, but a tapestry woven over centuries by many hands, from many shores. So, if Africans may have sailed west and Asians east, what else is hidden beneath the sands of time? Could there be artifacts buried in caves or beneath the waves that finally prove what oral traditions and ocean currents already suggest? And if so, how much longer can the Columbus myth survive before the tide of evidence sweeps it away? History, we're told, is built on evidence inscriptions, coins, bones, and ruins. But what happens when evidence surfaces that doesn't fit the accepted timeline? Again and again, archaeologists and explorers have stumbled upon objects that seem impossible, artifacts that suggest contact between worlds long before Columbus. Instead of rewriting the textbooks, these finds are usually dismissed, hidden in museum basements or branded as hoaxes. But the question is unavoidable. If these out-of-place discoveries are real, what else has been buried to protect the Columbus myth? Take the mysterious Roman coins found in the United States. Over the years, scattered discoveries of ancient coins have been reported from places as far apart as Maine. Tennessee and Arizona, mainstream historians argue these are lost curiosities, perhaps dropped by collectors in modern times. But some of the finds were unearthed deep in old layers of soil, long before coin collecting was common, if authentic. They suggest contact across the Atlantic that predates not just Columbus, but even the Vikings. Were they carried by shipwrecked traders? Drifted in cargo? Or do they point to something far more deliberate? Then there are the inscriptions in West Virginia. Strange carvings on a stone known as the Bat Creek inscription were once believed to be Cherokee. Later analysis suggested the characters more closely resembled ancient Hebrew. The Smithsonian originally cataloged it as native, but when the alternative interpretation surfaced, the artifact was quietly shelved. Skeptics dismissed the Hebrew link as wishful thinking, but the fact remains. Unexplained scripts keep surfacing in places they shouldn't exist. Perhaps the most provocative of all are the runestones. The most famous, the Kensington runestone found in Minnesota, supposedly records a Norse expedition in the 14th century. Mainstream scholars call it a hoax carved by Scandinavian settlers in the 1800s. Yet the sheer number of controversial runestones scattered across North America keeps fueling speculation. If even one of them were genuine, it would rewrite the entire history of pre-Columbian exploration. Artifacts aren't the only clues. Genetic markers have added a new layer of intrigue. Some studies suggest traces of DNA in certain indigenous groups that don't neatly match the migration routes from Asia. For example, haplogroup X, a genetic marker found in Europe and the Middle East, appears in some Native American populations, particularly around the Great Lakes. Mainstream science explains this as ancient migration via the Bering Strait thousands of years ago. But others argue its presence hints at more recent contact across the Atlantic. Could forgotten voyages have carried people and their genes into the Americas long before Columbus? Architecture raises even more questions. In Central and South America, structures like pyramids and step temples bear striking resemblance to those in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Official history says this is coincidence. Separate cultures independently built similar shapes because pyramids are efficient. But some researchers argue the parallels are too precise to ignore. The alignments with celestial bodies, the precision of stone cutting, and the shared symbolism suggest possible cross-cultural exchanges. If these similarities were found between two neighboring ancient civilizations, they'd be considered evidence of contact. But because they span oceans, they're brushed aside as chance. Then there's the case of the cocaine mummies in the 1990s. German researchers analyzed the remains of Egyptian mummies and discovered traces of nicotine and cocaine in their tissues. These substances come from plants native only to the Americas. The findings stunned the scientific community. How could an Egyptian, buried thousands of years before Columbus, carry chemical signatures of plants from the New World? Skeptics claimed contamination in the lab, but repeated tests confirmed the results. The simplest explanation, that there was some form of pre-Columbian contact, was also the most explosive, so it was largely ignored. Even more unsettling are the maps. The Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, shows parts of the Americas with startling accuracy. It even depicts the coastline of South America and, some argue, parts of Antarctica free of ice. Piri Reis himself admitted he compiled it using older charts, some from explorers long forgotten. If his sources included ancient maps of the Americas, then who charted them centuries or millennia earlier? And why have their identities vanished from history? The pattern is clear. Whenever evidence emerges that doesn't fit the Columbus first model, it's pushed aside. Sometimes the explanation is skepticism. Other times it's outright suppression. Museums lock controversial artifacts away, scholars label them hoaxes, and the public rarely hears the full story. But why? Why are these finds treated as dangerous rather than fascinating? One answer is academic inertia. Scholars build careers, reputations, and institutions on accepted timelines. To admit that Africans, Asians, or ancient seafarers reached the Americas first would mean rewriting not just books but entire worldviews. Another answer is national pride. If Columbus wasn't the first, then Spain's claim to the New World weakens. If China or Mali arrived earlier, the European conquest looks less like destiny and more like opportunism. For centuries, colonial powers needed Columbus as their symbolic anchor. The truth, no matter how compelling, became collateral damage. And yet, despite the resistance, the forbidden evidence refuses to go away. Amateur archaeologists, indigenous storytellers, and independent researchers keep bringing new pieces to light. Each artifact may be contested, but together, they point toward a bigger picture, a world far more connected than our textbooks admit. The deeper question is this: what else is hidden? How many artifacts sit unexamined in museum basements because they don't fit the script? How many carvings, coins, or bones have been quietly written off as frauds without serious investigation? And what would happen if tomorrow, undeniable proof surfaced, something that no one could ignore? Imagine a sealed chamber in the Americas containing an object unmistakably African, Asian, or Mediterranean, dating centuries before Columbus. Imagine the upheaval it would cause. School books rewritten, statues re-examined, national holidays reconsidered. That's the power of forbidden artifacts, not just to change our past, but to reshape our present. The story we've been told is neat, clean, and easy to remember. Columbus sailed in 1492 and discovered America, but reality is messy, filled with strange objects, genetic puzzles, and architectural echoes that stretch across oceans. The more you look at the evidence, the harder it is to believe that the Americas were untouched until a Spanish fleet arrived. The past whispers a different story, one of hidden journeys, silenced explorers, and artifacts that refuse to stay buried. So the question becomes, if so many clues exist, why do we still cling to the myth? And what would it mean if the forbidden artifacts finally forced the truth into the open? History isn't just about the past, it's about power. The way stories are told determines who gets celebrated, who gets forgotten, and who controls the narrative of identity. That's why the story of Columbus survived, while the stories of Vikings, Africans, Asians, and indigenous peoples were pushed aside. To understand why this happened, we need to look not only at what was discovered, but at who benefited from telling the story a certain way. When Spain sent Columbus westward, they weren't searching for truth. They were searching for wealth and control. His voyage gave Spain the symbolic right to claim entire continents, setting off centuries of conquest. Elevating Columbus as the first European in the Americas wasn't an accident. It was a political necessity. If Spain could argue it had found lands no one else knew about, it could justify seizing them. The Columbus myth wasn't built on evidence, it was built on empire. And once that story took hold, it became too valuable to challenge. Imagine what would have happened if Spain admitted that Norse explorers had reached America centuries earlier, or if scholars recognized African and Asian voyages as legitimate. The claim to discovery would collapse suddenly. Spain wouldn't be the bold pioneer, just another player in a long chain of contact. For an empire built on prestige and dominance, that was unacceptable. Colonial powers that followed had the same incentive. Portugal, France, Britain, all of them leaned on the idea that the Americas were new lands, waiting to be discovered. This erased indigenous nations who had lived there for thousands of years. It also erased any suggestion that non-European civilizations had crossed oceans. Why? Because if Africans or Asians had made contact first, then Europe's conquest would look less like progress and more like theft. National pride kept the Columbus story alive long after the age of empires faded. In the United States, Columbus became a symbol of exploration, courage, and destiny. Statues went up, holidays were declared, and generations of schoolchildren memorized the phrase, "In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue." It wasn't just a rhyme, it was a cultural anchor. Questioning it meant questioning the very foundation of the national identity. That's why alternative discoveries have been treated as dangerous. When archaeologists uncover artifacts that don't fit the timeline, they threaten more than just history books, they threaten deeply ingrained myths. Think about the Bat Creek stone, the Kensington rune stone, or the cocaine traces in Egyptian mummies. Each one should have sparked open debate. Instead, they were hidden, dismissed, or ridiculed. Why? Because acknowledging them would unravel a carefully built narrative. And that's the point. History is not neutral. It's curated, what gets displayed in museums, what gets written in textbooks, what gets taught in schools. These choices reflect power, not just evidence. When discoveries don't align with national pride, they're quietly shelved. When artifacts don't support the official story, they're labeled as frauds. This is how myths survive not by accident, but by design. But the truth has a way of seeping out. Indigenous oral traditions preserved stories of contact with strangers from across the sea long before Europeans arrived in force. Norse sagas described Vinland with details that matched real geography. West African chronicles recorded fleets setting out into the Atlantic. Chinese records hinted at expeditions beyond the Pacific. For centuries, these accounts were sidelined because they didn't serve the dominant narrative, and yet piece by piece they refused to disappear. Reframing the story of discovery isn't just about fairness to the past, it's about honesty in the present. Columbus didn't discover America. He arrived in a land already inhabited, already visited by others, already connected in ways that our textbooks rarely admit. To say he discovered it is like walking into someone's home, ignoring the people living there, and claiming you built the house. It's not discovery. It's erasure, and erasure has consequences. By centering Columbus, entire civilizations were reduced to footnotes. The Maya, Inca, Aztec, and countless indigenous nations became background scenery in Europe's heroic play. Their knowledge, achievements, and voices were overshadowed by a single man who, in truth, was neither first nor uniquely brave. The myth made him a hero. The reality paints him as one of many, and not even the most deserving. So why is it so hard to let go of the Columbus story? Because myths are comfortable. They give nations a simple origin, a clean narrative, a hero to point to. The real story, messy, global, interconnected, is harder to tell. It forces us to admit that history isn't about one man in 1492, but about a chain of human journeys stretching back thousands of years. That discovery was not a moment, but a process. That the Americas weren't isolated, but part of a larger web of contact and exchange. The truth is powerful, but it's also disruptive. If we teach that Vikings, Africans, and Asians all touched the Americas before Columbus, then European colonization loses its aura of inevitability. If we accept indigenous histories as valid sources of evidence, then the idea of a new world collapses. And if we admit that history has been shaped as much by politics as by archaeology, then we have to face uncomfortable questions about what else has been hidden. Perhaps that's why forbidden artifacts remain locked away, why controversial theories are dismissed, and why the Columbus myth continues to dominate. It's easier to protect the story than to confront the truth, but sooner or later, the evidence will pile too high to ignore. And when that day comes, the question won't be, who discovered America? It will be, why were we told such a simple lie for so long? The answer will cut deeper than Columbus. It will reveal how history itself is built, not just on facts, but on choices about which facts are allowed to matter. And once you see that, you realize the Columbus myth isn't just about the past. It's a lesson about the present, about power, about pride, about the truths still buried beneath the sands of time. So maybe the real story of America's discovery isn't about a single sailor in 1492. Maybe it's about a long chain of journeys, Norse, African, Asian, and indigenous, all converging on a land that was never lost, never empty, never waiting to be discovered. The tragedy is not that these journeys happened. The tragedy is that we chose to forget them. Now the choice is ours. Cling to the myth or embrace the truth, and if we embrace it, history will no longer be the story of one man's voyage, but of humanity's restless spirit, forever pushing beyond the horizon.